It promises freedom but delivers chains. Today, we live in a world where borrowing is as common as breathing. Yet, what happens when the freedom promised by debt turns into a lifelong sentence? It all starts with an illusion, the idea that debt is just a tool for progress. But as we piled on more, the system grew heavier, more restrictive. What started as a small, manageable burden became a way of life. The question is, who holds the chains? And more importantly, who has the power to break them? Sound familiar? We'll come back to this. The first debt was not financial. It was barter, a trust between two people. But it would soon evolve into something much more dangerous. Debt. It has always been part of our history. But its origins weren't in numbers or institutions. It started with trade. One thing for another. In ancient Mesopotamia, the first recorded debts were traded for goods, grain, livestock, labor. A mutual reliance. You owe me, I owe you. Simple, right? The Mesopotamians didn't think of it as a burden. It was just the price of doing business. But as civilizations grew, so did the complexity of debt. It moved beyond tangible goods. It became a tool of power. Then came the 16th century, the rise of banking systems. With the establishment of formal institutions like the Medici Bank, debt was no longer a personal exchange. It was institutionalized. It became a means to finance wars, build empires, and create markets that stretched across continents. Debt shifted. No longer just a tool for survival, it became a tool for growth, a means of economic stimulation. Kings borrowed from bankers and bankers profited. It was seen as an engine of prosperity. The idea was simple: borrow now, pay later. Build now, enjoy the future. But was that truly the birth of debt? Or did it come long before the banks, when people first promised more than they could deliver? Was debt a tool for progress, or a trap that would one day enslave the very people it was supposed to free? Confidence is collateral, and here we are. The echoes of those first promises still ring today. But did it really start with the banks? Or was debt always a chain in disguise? Debt built empires, but it also planted the seeds of inequality that would one day tear them apart. Empires don't just expand with armies. They expand with money. The British Empire at its peak stretched across vast oceans, its influence reaching every continent. But what many forget is how that expansion was funded: through debt. Colonial powers didn't just conquer lands. They borrowed to do so. Wars were financed with bonds, loans secured from the very citizens they sought to control. The first bonds weren't just issued to fund battles. They were issued to extend power. The royal treasury, short on funds, sold bonds to the public. The public became investors, and the crown became the debtor. The financial engine driving empire building was fueled by borrowed capital. As the wars raged on, the empires grew along with the class of creditors. These were the new power brokers, bankers, investors, financiers, those who held the debt, and thus the power. They didn't fight on the front lines. They never sailed on the ships. But they controlled the flow of resources, dictating the terms of war and peace alike. But what did debt cost? It didn't just create wealth, it sowed inequality. The working class was burdened with paying off loans they never took. The colonies, stripped of their wealth, were forced to repay what they could never afford. The very foundation of empire was built on this debt. Yet this system was anything but sustainable. Debt allowed nations to extend their reach, but it also left a deep scar. Those who borrowed for power eventually became slaves to their creditors. And the empires that once thrived on borrowed capital, they became vulnerable to collapse, weighed down by their own financial burdens. Debt is not just a tool for empire, it's the thread that unravels it. But what happened when the system turned on its own people? When those who profited from the empire found themselves in a debt trap of their own making? Debt and slavery are not just related, they are two sides of the same coin. Slavery wasn't just physical bondage, it was economic. For centuries, enslaved people worked not for themselves, but for those who owned their debt. In the colonial era, this system of forced labor was justified as a means of economic control. The idea was simple. If you owed money, you had to work it off. If you couldn't pay, you were bound to the land, to your masters. Your life was no longer your own. Debt was the chains, and labor was the payment. In the colonies, slaves weren't just laborers. They were the ultimate collateral. Their work generated profits for their owners, who borrowed money to finance the empire's expansion. The enslaved were trapped in a cycle, borrowing nothing yet bound by the debts of their owners. But this didn't just happen in the colonies. The same mechanism was at play within the empire itself. Workers, trapped in debt, were forced to toil in factories and on farms, their labor extracted for the benefit of the rich. This system wasn't just about ownership, it was about control. Economic freedom was controlled by those who held the debt, and if you couldn't escape, you worked for those who could. The financial system, then as now, was designed to keep the oppressed in their place. They were born into debt, worked for debt, and died in debt. Borrowing wasn't just a tool for growth, it was a tool for maintaining the status quo, keeping the powerful in power and the powerless in chains. Debt is the invisible chain that binds freedom. The question is, how does this history mirror today? When we talk about financial freedom, who is truly free? And who is paying the price? After the war, economies rebuilt. But what appeared to be freedom was built on the chains of debt. World War II had torn nations apart, but it also set the stage for the most transformative period in modern economic history. The global landscape was reshaped. Rebuilding required resources, and resources required borrowing. Governments, particularly in the West, had no choice but to go into debt. To rebuild cities, revive industries, and finance welfare systems, countries took on massive amounts of loans. In the years following the war, debt was framed as a necessity. It wasn't just about survival, it was about progress. The Marshall Plan, for instance, was a testament to this. The US loaned billions to Europe to help rebuild, and in return it built its own influence. The world was no longer divided by borders alone, but by financial agreements. Debt became a tool for political and economic expansion. Then the 1970s arrived and everything changed. The financial world was deregulated. For the first time, banks could lend without strict oversight. Governments borrowed more freely, individuals took on mortgages and credit cards, and corporations leveraged vast amounts of money to expand. The floodgates opened, debt soared. By the end of the 20th century, borrowing was no longer seen as a risk. It became the norm. The more you borrowed, the wealthier you appeared. The debt-based economy was viewed as a sign of prosperity. The constant expansion of credit created a false sense of security. More credit meant more spending. More spending meant more growth. And so the cycle continued. But with freedom came a new kind of bondage. The more nations borrowed, the more they relied on creditors. The economy expanded, but so did the debt. And as debt grew, so did the inequality. The rich got richer, and the poor became further entrenched in financial dependence. Debt is the freedom that enslaves. The question is, with all this prosperity, who was really in control? And when did debt stop being a tool for growth and start being a trap? Debt was sold as the ticket to freedom, but it was the kind of freedom that kept you locked in. Debt wasn't just a tool anymore. It became the product. In the 1980s, as credit cards hit the market, they promised something irresistible: freedom. No longer did you need to save up for what you wanted. Just swipe the card and you could have anything. From clothes to cars, from vacations to homes, the dream was within reach now. The marketing was everywhere. Buy now, pay later. The dream was simple. Debt was empowerment. You could live the life you wanted without waiting for it. Advertisements flashed on television screens promising a brighter future, one where you were the hero of your own story. Credit card companies offered rewards, loyalty points, and a promise of endless possibilities. For the first time, borrowing was not only encouraged, it was glamorized. This was the rise of consumerism, the idea that you could live in the now without consequence. Borrowing became the price of progress. The more you borrowed, the more you consumed. The more you consumed, the more the economy grew. It was a cycle that fed itself. What began as a necessity, a way to get ahead, became the new norm. People no longer saved to buy. They borrowed to live. Debt wasn't just for big investments. It was for everything. But what was the cost of this freedom? As credit cards became the symbol of success, the reality was something darker. The dream of limitless possibility hid the truth. Borrowing wasn't freedom. It was a way of keeping you dependent. The moment you couldn't pay, you were shackled. The debt didn't set you free. It trapped you in a system where the more you borrowed, the more you owed. Freedom without responsibility is just another form of control. And now, with this newfound freedom, who exactly holds the chains? And how long could we ignore the cost? Debt starts as a tool for freedom, but it becomes a trap that tightens with every turn.